A while back, I made a $150 PC build out of an old Optiplex, but in hindsight it had a couple issues, namely a graphics card bottleneck and a lack of upgradability. Almost a year later, we're coming back with the same budget and going all custom this time. To start off, we have the motherboard. It's an ASRock Z77 Pro 3, which I actually received for free from a local PC repair shop. I asked if they had any parts that they were going to throw away, and they gave me this motherboard along with a few other bits and pieces for free. Speaking of it, this is actually a really effective tactic of getting possibly working PC parts for free, as usually it's a simple fix away from working perfectly. Anyhow, they claimed the board didn't work, so I brought it home and examined it closely for reasons why. All the capacitors were good, and no board traces appeared to be cut, but the issue was quickly spotted. It seemed that 2 of the socket pins were bent, so I proceeded to bend them back into place, and it looked good to go. Now this is something you have to be especially careful with when it comes to these LGA boards. I've seen some boards that I couldn't take due to a completely messed up socket, so always be sure to examine this closely for damage before taking it. I got very lucky in this case. Now onto the board itself. It's a really nice board, having support for many extra features such as crossfire, USB 3, and very respectable overclocking abilities. Although in all honesty, this is to be expected for a high-end chipset from 2012. As for our CPU, we went for the Core i5-2380p, which I picked up for $15. To put it simply, it's a Core i5-2400 with no integrated graphics, meaning we got it much cheaper. It's clocked at 3.1 GHz on all 4 cores and is capable of boosting up to 3.4 GHz. It should offer decent performance and shouldn't bottleneck the graphics card we'll be pairing it with, especially when overclocked, something I'll get into a little later. Now the cooler is a story in itself. I know you're saying you got an Intel stock cooler and it won't perform well at all, but this stock cooler has a secret. It's actually meant for a Pentium D, which has a tremendously higher TDP than our Core i5, so it should be rather ideal for this situation, and besides, I got it for $10. Now moving on to RAM, we have 16 gigs of ADATA RAM clocked at 1600 MHz. For this setup, it's actually pretty decent and will be running in dual channel to further improve performance. I picked up these sticks for $20. Power supply is our EVGA 600 watt unit, which I unboxed a little while ago on my channel, a video I don't really recommend you watch. I got it for a cheap deal of $30 new, which is a really great price for a new power supply, especially considering this one has 80 plus efficiency. Now onto my favorite part of this PC, the graphics card. It's my own GTX 780, which I recently picked up for $70. So far it's the best card I own, and it comes with an EVGA styled blower cooler, very similar to Nvidia's own reference design. It runs at a core clock of 863 MHz and can boost up to 902 MHz, actually further with Nvidia's GPU Boost 2.0. Our temperature target is set to 80 degrees Celsius, so that would make for a maximum of around 1000 MHz. It supports all the latest APIs and in theory should give us performance between a GTX 1050 Ti and a GTX 1060 for a much lower cost. Now let's get on to building this system. First, I started off by placing the motherboard on a cardboard box I had lying around. I made a few modifications to the box, namely installing a power button, but that was about it. I had already installed the power supply off camera because who wants to see me cable manage a PC? Next, I slotted the CPU into place and secured it with a retention arm, finishing it off with a P of thermal paste. Next up, I installed our cooler, which is actually fairly beefy when you consider its price. It's using Intel's rather incompetent clip system, but with a little bit of patience I was able to get a decent mount. The RAM was the easiest component to install. Just slot them into the appropriate slots and clip them into place. As for the hard drive, I mentioned that I got a few bits and pieces with the motherboard. This happened to be one of them. Finally, we have the graphics card, which I'll say is rather large, but it fit in fine nonetheless. I secured the lock and proceeded to plug in these 6 and 8 pin connectors. So now that the system is all put together and ready to go, I'll be testing it in multiple aspects: general tasks and content consumption, overclocking and tuning, upgradability, and of course, gaming. First off, before we get into the other tests, can we overclock the system? The answer is yes, actually. The motherboard features no KOC capabilities, which in essence lets us bump up the clock speed of our CPU by 400 MHz. You could do some extra adjustments via VCLK, but things could quickly go wrong there, so I won't be touching it in this video. As for our memory, I bumped up the clock speed to 2133 MHz, which should vastly increase performance. Finally, the graphics card. For this part, I adjusted temperature target in MSI Afterburner from 80 to 85, which should slightly increase our maximum boost, but keep in mind you are treating thermals for performance here. Now, finally moving on to the tests. General tasks were perfect on this system, and even multitasking was a breeze. I was able to browse the web with many tabs open while unzipping files and downloading programs all at the same time. This really comes down to the large amount of RAM and overall horsepower this system has. Content consumption was flawless on this system. 1080p was no sweat for this machine, and even 1440p could be played without stutter, making for an overall very solid and consistent experience. On terms of upgradability, this system covers all the bases. You could easily swap in another graphics card given the large amount of headroom our power supply has, and even two if you utilize Crossfire. The CPU upgrade path is also quite expansive, as this motherboard supports even the best of Ivy Bridge processors. For the RAM, you could easily buy another 2 8GB sticks for a total of 32GB of RAM, a very respectable amount even for today's standards. So yeah, this computer is very upgradable, and it could still be more than competent years down the road. Alright now, let's get serious. You guys didn't come here to see if this PC could browse the web. So let's take a look at this set of gaming benchmarks, and to say the least, the results are quite surprising. Well, if those benchmarks didn't prove it already, I don't know what will. This PC is incredibly good for the money, and while of course we didn't use a proper case, but aesthetics aren't the point. Performance is where this thing shines. It's a rather easy result to replicate as well, as long as you ask around some computer shops and receive, most importantly, the motherboard for free. To summarize, as long as you're willing to put in some work and patience, you could build an outstanding gaming PC for cheap. Finally though, as much as it's been said already, please stay home and stay safe. I wouldn't try anything like this until the viral outrage subsided. Before I end the video, I'd like to tell you about my new Discord server I recently started up. Here you can talk PCs, showcase your builds, and even get help for computer problems you have. Link in the description. Well, that'll be it for this one. Like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you all in the next one. Take care.